Hello and welcome to Penguin Classics On Air. This is Elda Rotor, editorial director of Penguin Classics. Today's program is called The Birth of the Knickerbocker, Washington Irving's A History of New York. We're excited about this not only because Penguin's office is located in New York, but because 2009 marks the bicentennial of the book's publication, as well as the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson's landing in New York. Washington Irving's popular first book was an early 19th century satirical novel of colonial New Amsterdam. The fictional historian Diedrich Knickerbocker narrates the development of early New York cultural life, from the creation of the doughnut to the creation of Wall Street. The term Knickerbocker originates from this book, so for all those who claim to be true New Yorkers, we have here a real native in Irving's fictional Knickerbocker. Today's guest is Elizabeth L. Bradley, the introducer and editor of the Penguin Classics edition. Betsy is Deputy Director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. She's the author of Knickerbocker, The Myth That Made New York. Her work on New York City history and culture has been published in Book Forum and the New York Journal of American History. So stay with us for our talk on Washington Irving's A History of New York.
This program is brought to you by Penguin Classics. In a world of choices, there's only one real classic. Penguin Classics.
Welcome back to Penguin Classics On Air. Tell me first, where was Irving in his life and literary career when he first published A History of New York?
Irving was a 26-year-old apprentice in the law offices of Judge Josiah Hoffman, who was a big deal in the New York of the day. He had chosen not to go to Columbia College like his brothers, and instead was attempting very half-heartedly to become a lawyer. He had just folded a literary magazine called Salmagundi, which he had run with some friends for 1 year. The magazine had been quite a success, and I think emboldened by that experiment, Irving tried his hand at a satire all on his own and quickly gave up the law after that.
Originally, the book was published under a false name. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, it's I guess it's to say false name makes it sound like Irving was trying to hide something, when in fact I think it was a literary device that was pretty common at the time. You could say that the person he was imitating the most would be Ben Franklin with Poor Richard, but the false name came about by way of a series of really fantastical advertisements that were placed, classified ads really, that placed in the Evening Post, the New York paper of the time. They listed as sort of missing or wanted ads the description of a man who had been a tenant of a hotel called the Columbian Hotel on Mulberry Street. And the proprietor of the hotel was looking for the man, looking for him to pay back rent, and commenting that he had all the belongings that this old guy had left in his room. The missing man was named Diedrich Knickerbocker, and he wasn't real, nor was the hotel, nor was the proprietor. They were ways of increasing interest in this soon-to-be published book on the part of the New York reading public. And it worked so well that, in fact, people suggested coming up with a campaign to try and locate poor Mr. Knickerbocker, who had mysteriously vanished. Really, it was a way, I think, and we can talk about this some more, it was a way for Irving to show that, this was a book by an authentic Dutch New Yorker. He, instead of using his own name, he was of Scotch-Irish descent, he was writing from the perspective of an original New Yorker, a Dutchman.
And what was his book a reaction to then?
It was a reaction to a couple things. First and foremost was the New York Historical Society, which had been founded in 1804 by what you could really only call a set of city fathers who had been placing these very anxious pleas for information because they hadn't actually been able to come up with any history to showcase in the Historical Society. And Irving was, on the one hand, making fun of this admission of ignorance on the part of the brand new Historical Society, combined with the sense of entitlement that these city fathers had about New York and that the proprietary nature of information about New York. It was something he would always love to make fun of, as the pompous New Yorker. But he was also making fun of a book that came out of this call for information. It was called The Picture of New York by Gentlemen Residing in the City, and it was written by Samuel Latham Mitchell. It was meant to be a complete guide to New York City as it currently was, including the history. And in fact, it was really more of a geologist study with information about flora and fauna and trade regulations, very little about life in the contemporary city, and almost nothing about Dutch New York, which Irving found a pretty amazing omission.
And what was New York like under the Dutch?
Well, New York under the Dutch was a lot more like contemporary New York than New York under the British, that's for sure. It was a mercantile town. It was very diverse. There were as many languages spoken then as you could say there are in contemporary, Flushing, Queens. It was a trading outpost in the New World that was inhabited by people from all over the world. It also had the first Jewish settlers in the New World. But I think it's dangerous to romanticize New York when it was New Amsterdam, because it was still a place where slavery was legal, and the sale of slaves was also legal. And Peter Stuyvesant was a notoriously anti-Semitic governor. So while I think we can call it a diverse and interesting cosmopolitan little place, it wasn't a paradise.
And how is life under the British Americans different?
Well, what's interesting about that question is that I'm not sure that Irving could have answered that question. He was born the year that the Revolutionary War ended and named, it said, in honor of George Washington. So he really, the New York that he inherited was one that really was its own thing. I think the British, it's fair to say, brought in their own social hierarchy and were much more concerned with allegiance to the motherland than were the Dutch, who did not have the same kind of aristocratic trappings. There were, as Irving would later write, many corrupt governors under the British, and the streets were renamed for all their kings and queens. As we all know, there was taxation without representation. But the British, it's fair to say, understood the importance of New York. They chose to make it their headquarters when they occupied the city during the Revolutionary War. For a country that was famously loyal, they did say that it was the pleasantest place they had seen outside of London.
Did this book affect anything Irving later wrote?
I'd have to say it affected everything he later wrote, because it was really the book that brought him his first fame and led to him being known today as the father of the American short story. He would resurrect the figure of Diedrich Knickerbocker and this entire landscape of Dutch New York and the Hudson River Valley for the stories for which he's best known today, which would be Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It also created a cottage industry for the Hudson River Valley in general. Knickerbocker, as we can discuss later, was seized upon by a variety of New York enterprises.
And what was the public's or the New York Historical Society's reaction to his book?
Well, I guess two different. The first, I'd say the public's reaction was one of an instant embrace. The book really brought him an instant fame. Knickerbocker was appropriated by New Yorkers. The term and the idea of the character was appropriated almost instantly, and it became a real mascot for New York City. The Historical Society, on the other hand, had a mixed reaction. I think it's fair to say that Irving's book drew attention to the city and to the city's history that had not come before. And actually, in the process of drawing the ire of some Dutch descended New Yorkers who read the book, also reinforced the necessity for the kind of information that he was calling out, the kind of information he was showing did not exist. One way in which we can see the after effects is that several genealogical societies sprang up almost instantly to celebrate the contributions of the Dutch New Yorkers who people like Samuel Mitchell had left out of their histories. And strangely enough, one of these groups, the St. Nicholas Society, actually appointed Irving as a kind of honorary first member. He was not of Dutch descent. He technically didn't have the right qualifications to be a member, but he was included nonetheless because they really at that point were savvy enough to know better than to leave out the father of the New York City story. So he became part of the fabric of old New York, even as he was the first to make fun of it.
You're listening to Penguin Classics On Air.
This program is brought to you by Penguin Books, publisher of The Shadow of the Wind. Called One Gorgeous Read by Stephen King, this Gothic novel remains a favorite of booksellers and readers alike. The Shadow of the Wind, now available with a new cover in paperback.